So our next speaker is well known to most people here. David Chalmers is a very well-known philosopher. He burst on the scene at the first Tucson conference with his iconic talk on the hard problem. He's moved on to bigger, better, greater things and is really recognized as one of the world's top philosophers of mind and in several other areas. And he will talk today about the virtual and the real. Dave, come on up.
Okay, thanks, Stu. This is going to be a bit of a change of pace. I'm going to be focusing on some philosophical issues about virtual reality technology. Towards the end, I'll connect it to some more general issues about physical and mental reality. But to start with, the focus will be fairly narrow on some current technology. Here is a bit of virtual reality technology that many of you may have heard of. This is the Oculus Rift, which just had its consumer version released a few weeks ago. I actually ordered one of these, and I just got an email from Amazon saying my Oculus Rift has arrived today, so I'm making a big sacrifice by being here. But I have to give this talk in order to be able to charge it to my NYU research account. This is the Oculus Rift together with the Oculus Touch controllers, which gives the impression of being in a virtual world, something like this. Here are two people playing ping pong in virtual reality just by moving around their Oculus Touch controllers, and there's a world of objects there that they can pick up and interact with. Now, virtual reality is great for a philosopher because it raises all kinds of really interesting metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical issues. Is virtual reality real? Is it a genuine reality or a false or fictional reality? Is it somehow on a par with physical reality? There's a very common view that it's not. William Gibson even has called virtual reality a kind of consensual hallucination, as if there's something unreal about it. As this talk goes on, I really want to argue for the view that virtual reality is a genuine form of reality and that it is on a par with physical reality. But first, some definitions. What is virtual reality? A virtual reality environment is an immersive, interactive, computer-generated environment. And rather than running through the definitions of those three things, I'll just illustrate them. Here is the definition of immersiveness. Not virtual reality, virtual reality. So it's immersive when it's right up there in front of your eyes, generating the 3D impression of a world around you. If it's just a 2D image on the screen, then that doesn't count as immersive. It might still be a virtual world, but not genuine virtual reality. How about interactiveness? Here's an illustration of interactiveness. This is actually me playing virtual tennis against Maria Sharapova. Last year at the US Open, they had a virtual tennis exhibition where you put on a headset and you got to inside the VR. I'm moving my tennis racket and hitting the tennis ball. I actually did pretty well. I got the ball over the net, maybe once. But importantly, it's interactive. My actions are actually making a difference to what happens in the VR, as opposed to something more passive and movie-like where you don't affect it. Now, so far, these two conditions, immersiveness and interactiveness, are not just satisfied by virtual reality, they're satisfied by perfectly ordinary physical reality, which is, I take it, immersive and interactive. What makes virtual reality distinctive is that it's computer-generated, that somehow this virtual world that you're interacting with is grounded in processes inside a computer. At least the orthodox view is that ordinary physical reality is not that way. Of course, some people have entertained the hypothesis that it is, but that's still at best a speculative hypothesis, that our world is itself some kind of simulation. So that's virtual reality. It's also worth making a distinction between permanent and temporary virtual reality. Permanent virtual reality is very familiar to philosophers and science fiction, the kind of hypothesis that we've been living in virtual reality our whole lives. One of the VRs, such as The Matrix. Actually, a number of years ago at the Tucson conference, I talked about the philosophical status of a permanent VR, such as The Matrix. But here I really want to focus on something much more mundane and present with existing technology, temporary virtual reality, where you just go in, use a headset, you engage with a virtual world for a while, and then you come out. Something that you might do with current technology, like the Oculus Rift or the Samsung Gear VR or whatever. What's the philosophical status of that? So a lot of this is going to involve virtual objects and the status of virtual objects, the objects that you find in a virtual world. We'll say these are the objects contained in the virtual worlds that we seem to perceive and interact with. Paradigms of virtual objects will be avatars, the virtual bodies that we use to interact in a virtual world, virtual buildings, virtual treasures, and so on. I'll also be talking about virtual experiences, the conscious experiences that one has when using a VR. And I want to be talking about the interaction and the status of these virtual objects and their virtual experiences. The big questions I'll be addressing are four. One about virtual objects. Are they real? Are they fictional? One about events in virtual worlds. Do they, in fact, really happen? One about virtual experiences and their guide to reality. Are virtual experiences illusory? Are they illusions? Or are they somehow non-illusory, revealing genuine facts about the world? And fourth is a question about value. Are experiences in VR as valuable as experiences outside it? These are all, I think, questions that are going to become more and more pressing as we spend more and more time in virtual worlds. People already are spending a lot of time in non-immersive virtual worlds, video games, Facebook, whatever. I take it that over coming years, we're going to be spending more and more time in these virtual realities, and questions like these are going to become really quite pressing, especially the fourth. How valuable, how real, how worthy is experience in VR? So the view I want to defend is one I'll call virtual realism. Virtual objects are real. Virtual events really happen. Virtual experiences are non-illusory. And experiences in VR are as valuable as experiences outside it, or at least that they can be as valuable as experiences outside it. So virtual reality is on a par in many ways with physical reality. The opposing view is virtual irrealism. Virtual objects are not real. Virtual events do not really happen. Virtual experiences are illusory, and experiences in VR are less valuable than experiences outside it. Now, virtual irrealism is probably the dominant view. And there's a particular version of it that's particularly popular, which is that virtual worlds and virtual objects are fictional. They don't really exist. They at best exist in the way that objects in fictions exist, like in Lord of the Rings. Middle-earth is and Gandalf. Gandalf is a virtual character, and Middle-earth is a virtual. Middle-earth is a fictional world, and Gandalf is a fictional character. On this view, the virtual worlds of virtual reality are like Middle-earth and Gandalf. They don't really have first-class existence status. They're merely fictional. If you take that view, you'll get a view I call virtual fictionalism. Virtual objects are fictional objects. Virtual events take place only in fictional worlds. Virtual experiences involve illusory perception of a fictional world, and experiences in virtual reality have the sort of value that engagement with fiction has, which is maybe some kind of value, but a much more limited, I take it, kind of value than the kind of value you get from or general interaction with a non-fictional reality. So my view, just to presage, is quite different from virtual fictionalism. It's a view I'll call virtual digitalism. Virtual objects are digital objects, computational objects, somehow tied up to computation, that really exist. Virtual events are digital events that really happen. Virtual experiences involve non-illusory perception of a digital world. And life in digital virtual reality is, or can be, about as valuable as life outside it. Maybe that's initially counterintuitive, but it's a view I want to defend. So I'm going to take the four questions one by one in what follows, starting with the one about virtual objects. Are virtual objects real or fictional? I think it's plausible that at least some video games, for example, involve fictional worlds. You play the Lord of the Rings video game set in Middle-earth, well, if the movie and the novels and so on are fictional, so is the video game. That's pretty plausible. Or video games with alternative courses of history for the Second World War, those are pretty clearly fictional. I mean, here's one involving Hitler and the true holy spear and the Nyaya Thotem. I take it none of that stuff ever actually happened to Hitler. So this is pretty clearly fictional. However, I mean, these video games, I think, involve fictions, not because they're virtual, but because they're games. And in particular, because they're role-playing games. If we reenacted something about Gandalf or something about Hitler here in the physical world with our ordinary physical bodies, it would be equally fictional because it's a game, not because of virtuality or otherwise. Furthermore, not all video games involve fictions. There are games like Tetris or Pong or Second Life, even, that got nothing particular to do with role-playing, just certain forms of interaction. And then a fictional element is much harder to find. And importantly, not all virtual worlds are game worlds. People are already using VR for training or communication. It's more and more, I think, going to be used as a social medium. And then the fictional elements, I think, tend to drop out of the picture. So fictional role-playing video games, I think, are a misleading model for VR in general. We take Second Life, for example, very well-known virtual world platform, which people use just for, not so much for gaming, but for general interaction. Two people's avatars walk into a room and talk with each other in Second Life. Where's the fiction here? So here's the scenario. A couple of people walk into a room in VR, they're avatars, and they have a mundane conversation. So where's the fiction here? I mean, if there's a fiction, I take it it's fictional that they have these avatars, that there's a room, that the avatars are in the room, and so on. But I think that's, my own views, that is the wrong way to think about what's going on in a virtual world such as Second Life. In Second Life, people really do have these avatars. They're virtual bodies, not physical bodies, a different kind of thing, but equally real. The room is a virtual room, not a physical room, but equally real. The avatars, the virtual bodies, really are in the virtual room. There's nothing at all fictional about those claims. Those are just genuinely true claims about reality. I mean, then, of course, that raises the question, what is a virtual object, such as an avatar? And I want to say it's a digital object, constituted by computational processes. Most likely, it's a data structure, or something constituted by data structures, something that really exists on, for example, the servers of Second Life, or on your own computer if you're interacting with a virtual world that's supported there. I mean, I take it that every virtual object in Second Life corresponds to a data structure on their servers. When I see a virtual object, like someone else's avatar, it's that data structure that causes my experience. When two virtual objects interact, these data structures really are interacting. Those are real objects in the real world that are interacting and causing my experience. I think you could actually use this to mount a couple of philosophical arguments for virtual realism, particularly for virtual digitalism, about these objects. Intuitively, virtual objects have certain causal powers to affect, avatars affect other virtual objects. The balls in the ping pong room are all kind of knocking each other around. Virtual objects affect other virtual objects, they affect users. Digital objects really have those causal powers. When you're interacting with this stuff on the Oculus Rift, there's something going on inside your computer which is actually causing your experiences interacting with each other, and nothing else does. So, conclusion, virtual objects are digital objects. It's digital objects on the computer that play these causal roles. There's also an argument from perception. When using virtual reality, we perceive, very plausibly, virtual objects. Also a very plausible general claim about perception. The objects we perceive are the causal basis of our perceptual experiences. Well, when using VR, it sure looks like the causal basis of our perceptual experiences are certain digital objects, certain processes going on on the computer. Putting all those three premises together, you get the conclusion: virtual objects are digital objects. Now, there's a lot that the fictionalist might say in response to this, and it leads to a complicated dialectic. You can at least see this as making an initial case. One thing the fictionalist might do is make some kind of counter argument, just along the lines of, come on, look, this avatar is supposedly a dragon. Okay, here's my avatar, it's a dragon. Okay, come on, there are no dragons in the real world. We know that perfectly well. No real object is a dragon, therefore, my avatar is not a real object, because there are no dragons. Well, I think the response to this is reasonably clear. So my avatar, sure, my avatar is not a physical dragon, and there are no physical dragons. My avatar is a virtual dragon, which is quite distinct from a physical dragon. The virtual dragon is a real digital object which really exists on the computer. So the virtual dragon is real. So this now leads us into the second question about virtual events and properties. Do virtual events really happen? Do virtual objects have the properties we take them to have? So even if virtual objects are digital objects, you might worry, digital objects do not have the properties that virtual objects have or seem to have, like color, like size, like motion, and so on. You know, my avatar is a certain shade of red. And you might say, okay, just say it's a certain shade of red that nothing in the real physical world has. Certainly the digital object needn't have it. If you look inside the computer, that digital object is probably not painted red. You know, you're not going to find redness there inside the computer. So the dragons being red doesn't correspond to reality. Well, here there's a very natural response. My avatar is not red in the ordinary physical sense, but it's virtually red. And the digital object is virtually red too. Just as we distinguish physical dragons from virtual dragons, let's distinguish physical redness from virtual redness. What is virtual redness? Well, what is redness in the first place? Tough question, but it's something like redness is that property of physical objects that goes along with the power to cause a certain kind of experience, conscious experience of redness, under normal conditions. Well, we can just translate that kind of account to virtual redness. Virtual redness is roughly the power to cause that kind of experience under conditions which are normal for virtual reality. Of course, the conditions which are normal for virtual reality are quite different from those that are normal for ordinary physical reality. It's something like viewing through a headset. The data structure really does have that power under normal for virtual reality conditions, and presumably the property that causes that is some kind of entry in a data structure encoding the color. That might be what we identify virtual redness with, and the digital object really will be virtually red, just as a physical object is physically red in virtue of having some physical property on its surface. Likewise, I think for virtual space, which is really a very interesting topic in its own right. You might say, well, come on, these things in virtual reality seem to have certain spatial relations. Things seem to be 2 meters long. There's nothing in the computer that's 2 meters across. So I think we also have to separate virtual distances, virtual shapes, and so on for virtual objects. And I think the story for space is relevantly analogous to the story for color. What's virtual space? It's whatever causes spatial experiences and guides quasi-spatial interactions. I actually think that's the right story for physical space too. You start looking at quantum mechanics, you start looking at relativity, space gets very complicated. I think ultimately space is identified via its functional role. Once you tell that kind of story, it works very well for virtual reality too. I call this spatial functionalism, where space gets identified as what plays the space role. Well, virtual space also gets identified as what plays the space role inside the computer. In virtual worlds, there really are certain patterns of interaction among virtual objects. What's distance, for example? Distance, I love this little saying due to Brian Cantwell Smith, that take the old statement, there's no action at a distance. And you might have thought that was a substantive claim about distance, but you reconstrue that as a definition of distance. Distance is what there's no action at. Distance is a measure of the potentiality for action. Something like that works really well for thinking about relativity and quantum mechanics in an appropriately qualified form. Likewise for virtual reality. Virtual space, and indeed physical space, emerges from patterns of causal interaction. Okay, so that's the beginnings of a metaphysics of virtual objects and virtual properties. Now to bring the mind in. What about illusions? Are virtual experiences illusory? You might say, sure, these things are real, but somehow our perception of them still involves an illusion. Is perceptual experience in virtual reality illusory in that it reveals the reality the way it is, a way it's not? Or is it veridical, revealing it the way it is? Or in less technical language, when experiencing VR, are things the way they look to be? So my claim is that at least for many users of temporary VR, many or most experiences will not be illusory. And I'd like to motivate this by an analogy with the experience of looking in a mirror. Is ordinary experience on looking at a mirror illusory? Really interesting question. In its own right, here's Obama looking in the mirror. Is he undergoing an illusion? If there's an illusion, it's that there's a person out there through the glass, on the other side of the glass. When there's not, that's one view. The other view is he's seeing himself roughly where he is, and he's correct. View one, the illusion view. It appears that there are objects so arranged on the far side of the glass where there aren't, an illusion. View two, it appears there are objects so arranged on the near side of the glass where they really are, not an illusion. Well, what's the right view? I think you can certainly get both kinds of cases. In some cases, mirror experiences clearly seem illusory. Sometimes you don't even know that a mirror is present. You just take it. There are things on the other side of the glass. It seems that way perceptually. That's an illusion. But for an expert user of mirrors who knows a mirror is present, I think there's no illusion. And my favorite case is the rearview mirror of a car. When driving a car and looking in the rearview mirror, do the cars visible in the mirror perceptually appear to be in front of you or behind you? So here you are, driving down the road, looking in the rearview mirror. One line, do the cars there look to be in front of you or behind you? One line, the illusion view will say, it actually seems to you perceptually that there are cars out there on the road, weirdly facing towards you, but staying a constant distance from you as you go along. I don't know, my experience of driving is just not like that. To me, it perceptually seems that the cars are behind me at a constant distance, and that's where they seem to be. Here's a sunset in the rearview mirror. Does it seem like the sun is shining up through a hole in the road, perceptually? No. For an expert user of cars and rearview mirrors, the sun seems to be behind you. Our knowledge of mirrors has somehow penetrated our experience. Phenomenologically, it just seems incorrect to say that the cars visible in the mirror appear to be in front of you. They appear to be behind you. There's a lot of dialectic around here, but I'll skip over it. What are the key features of the car case that make it a plausible case of non-illusion? I think partly knowledge, we know it's a mirror. Partly familiarity, we're used to using the mirror. Partly a connection between action and experience. Like we've learned dispositions to react to mirrors that depend on it. Like seeing objects in the mirror, it comes up fast, you steer away, and so on. That's very important. And there's something also perhaps about the naturalness of one interpretation compared to the other that plays a role. So I think this is plausibly a case of what philosophers sometimes call cognitive, and psychologists call cognitive penetration. What you know or believe makes a difference to how things are perceived as being. Depending on whether or not one believes it's a mirror, objects seem to be in front of or behind the glass. So cognition makes a difference to perception. More specifically, I call this the cognitive orientation of perception. Background knowledge somehow determines the general orientation of how things seem to be in a perceptual experience. So perception changes with what one believes. Anyway, I've gone through all this about mirrors because I think everything I've said about mirrors applies to virtual reality and to the question of, is the experience of virtual reality an illusion? So here's a fanciful depiction of a subject in VR. Is she undergoing an illusion or not? I think it's analogous to the mirror case. One certainly can get illusions in VR. For example, if you enter VR, say for the first time without knowing it's a VR, you'll perceive objects as in front of you in ordinary space when the objects aren't there. So here's a picture. This guy's been a bit of a bender, I take it, and someone's put a Google Cardboard VR device onto him, and he doesn't know he's in VR. He's like, oh man, what's going on out there? And undergoing the illusion that all this is going on in physical space. But what about after much time in VR, when you know it's in VR? Well, then I think it's analogous. So here's Palmer Luckey, the CEO of Oculus, the got bought out by Facebook for $2 billion. He's presumably interacted with VR a whole lot. Well, I think that after some time in VR, you adapt to VR, treating it as a separate space with separate objects. You take the objects to be located in a virtual space as they are. You perceive the objects as located in a virtual space too. And that's an accurate guide to virtual reality. Rather than having the illusion this is going on in physical reality, you've got the accurate perception of virtual reality. I think just as you get cognitively oriented to using a mirror, you get cognitively oriented to VR with corresponding novel sorts of action dispositions. For example, here's Magic Leap. This is a mixed or augmented reality technology where somehow the headset manages to project the image of an elephant into your real hands, and you can somehow interact with both. And I have the sense that expert users of VR are able to distinguish the two, and you actually have a kind of a phenomenology of virtuality. That the things which are virtual, you've got a sense of which things are virtual. The cognitive orientation to VR is associated with a distinctive phenomenology of virtuality. At least initially, is going to go along with very distinctive action dispositions. For example, in VR, objects tend to be visible and audible, but not tangible. You can put your hand right through them, and that's a different kind of sensory motor action disposition that's associated with the object, which I think is going to give it a different kind of phenomenology, a different kind of conscious experience of perceiving objects that one knows to be virtual. I think as we use VR more and more, this non-illusion view is going to seem increasingly plausible. I talked to a few people who develop VR and virtual worlds, and they already think this is kind of the obvious view of VR, that it's a real world that we're accurately perceiving as virtual, not a fictional world that we're inaccurately perceiving as physical. There's also the question about virtual value. Are experiences in VR as valuable as experiences outside VR? There's a famous thought experiment here that philosophers love. Robert Nozick's case of the experience machine, put forward in his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, that sometimes is read as casting doubt on the value of life in VR. Suppose there's an experience machine, would give you any experience you desired, the super-duper neuropsychologists stimulate your brain so you think and feel you're writing a great novel, making a friend, reading a book. All the time you're floating in a tank with electrons attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life? Pre-programming your life's experiences. And Nozick gives the answer no, a very resounding no. Many people take this to cast doubt on whether life in VR is really worth living. Well, Nozick turns out to have three main problems with the experience machine. First, it's pre-programmed, so you have no autonomy. Second, it's illusory. The experience you have are illusory. You want to actually do things, not to have the experience of doing them. And third, it's artificial. He thinks we value natural reality as opposed to human-made reality. I think none of those, well, all of those are fairly weak reasons for worrying about VR. One thing, genuine VR is interactive, not pre-programmed. You go into Second Life or even a video game, what happens is to some large extent up to you, not pre-programmed. Certainly in an open-ended virtual world, the pre-programming objection that raises worries about autonomy doesn't arise. And if I'm right, VR is really non-illusory. One really acts in VR. When one moves one's body, one genuinely perceiving an action of one's virtual body, not one's physical body, but none the worse for that. And yes, it's true that VR may be artificial and one may have some valuing of the natural, but hell, so are cities. So is New York City. It's an artificial city. It's okay. It's not to everyone's taste, but it's still a place where people manage to lead pretty valuable lives. So this is just, this is to some extent, more a matter of taste or a matter of having genuine value or lacking it. So I'm inclined to say VR has the same sort of value as certain bits of physical reality. Maybe the artificial bits, maybe the newly developed bits. Yes, it lacks a certain kind of history. I'd like to make an analogy with something like terraform reality. Just say we had a technology to design new physical planets designed for new experiences. They would lack some sources of value, naturalness, history, but many new sources deriving from all the new kinds of experiences we could have there. So I think life in VR is in principle on a par with life outside VR when it comes to value. So virtual reality is not, on this view, a second-class reality. It's potentially a first-class reality. Okay, so in the time I have left, I just want to say, I've addressed now those 4 questions. I just want to say something about the underlying philosophical view of reality that might lead one to say that virtual reality is genuine reality, not a second-class reality. I mean, there's one natural view that might tend to lead there. That's the one that's probably already been thinking about, the view known as idealism. For some virtual realists, what drives their view is idealism. All reality is mental reality. And in fact, I think we heard Deepak articulating a version of idealism in the last talk. There's a famous version due to George Berkeley. He says, esse est percipi. Basically, to be is to be perceived. If you have the appearances, you have the reality. In VR, you have all the appearances of a normal reality, so you have the same reality. And I think idealism could get us to a virtual realist conclusion, but it's not a route that I want to take. I mean, at least one canonical form of idealism is what we might call observer idealism, where reality is constituted by the perceptions of ordinary observers, like those of human observers, for example. So when Deepak talks about the human universe, it's this picture that I hear. Now, I think there's a fatal flaw for observer idealism, which is that the universe is constituted by our observer experiences. It's you need non-observer, some kind of non-observational reality, some non-observer constituted reality to explain what observers observe. When a scientist does an experiment for the first time, when 10 scientists independently do experiments for the first time and come up with a surprising result, and they all get the same result. We need something to explain that remarkable coincidence of their experiences, and that needs to be some reality outside their experiences. When we go to Antarctica, or when we go to Pluto for the first time and have novel experiences, you need something outside our experiences to explain the experiences. Ultimately, to explain all of those regularities within our observations and our experiences, you need something external to our observations with something like the fine structure of physical reality, some fine structure that goes way beyond the structure contained within our experiences. So that's my worry for, say, the human universe view. But there is a view nearby which I like, which is a kind of structuralism about reality, and in particular about physical reality. There's a physical world outside our minds, but our grasp on physical reality is structural. We grasp it as a certain pattern of causal mathematical structure. So, it's like, this is really our grasp on physical reality. Its intrinsic nature is not really revealed to us, but we do have very good reason for believing in this fine structure of certain entities and certain interactions outside of ourselves. And it's really the structure that we get a grasp on, not the intrinsic nature. It may have an underlying intrinsic nature, but if so, we don't know what it is. And it could even be that the underlying intrinsic nature involves consciousness. Maybe, for example, it's the mind of God with all that fine structure, or maybe, perhaps more plausibly, it's a whole lot of panpsychist particles with all of that consciousness of those particles is underlying the structure. But you need all that fine structure for physical reality. And those are just 2 hypotheses among many for what the intrinsic nature could be. So I think when we think of virtual reality as less real than physical reality, we're basing this on the illusion that we have an intrinsic grasp of physical reality. We think that we grasp what solidity really is, or what spatiality really is, and we feel that VR just isn't solid in the same way that virtual stone isn't solid. It doesn't really take up space in the same way. It doesn't have that intrinsic essence of solidity or spatiality. But I think once you recognize that really, especially in light of modern science, what we really grasp about solidity is its effects on us. What we really grasp about space is certain modes of interaction. We really just grasp the structure of these things. Our grasp on physical reality is no different in principle than it seems from our grasp on virtual reality. It's all a bunch of structure. So in virtual reality, the structural reality is present. I think the causal mathematical structure really exists inside the computer. The structure is realized by more basic processes, for example, inside the computer, but that's very common with structures. So I'm going to say, in virtue of sharing that kind of common structure, VR is just as real as physical reality. I mean, if you like, here's my slogan about the elements of reality. Mental reality, which is consciousness, and structural reality, the physical world, come together to yield reality. In VR, the structural reality is present in the computer. The mental reality is also present in the mind of the user. Structural reality plus mental reality come together to yield genuine reality. The open question then is, what's the relationship between mental reality and structural reality? And alas, I'm not going to be able to answer that one here, but it's a classic question in the study of consciousness. Really, I think there are about 4 options. One is mental reality is reducible to and grounded in structural reality. That's the functionalist view. And for well-known reasons, I and many others at this conference reject that as too deflationary about the mental. There's also the view that structural reality is grounded in mental reality, or at least in the structure of mental reality. And there are panpsychist views, for example, that manage to take that line. That's a view that's getting a lot of discussion at the conference. There's also the view there's a common ground to the two, something proto-mental, proto-structural that grounds both, or just the view that they're distinct, which is a kind of dualism. My own view is all of these are, to some extent, options, but one needs to recognize 2 fundamental components here, the structural and the mental, or maybe the proto-mental, and any viable option has got to recognize both the structural and the mental, or something like it, as elements. So anyway, I'll just wrap up with my general conclusions. The conclusion about reality I can put as a kind of equation. Reality equals structural reality plus mental reality. And my conclusion about virtual reality, more specifically, is that virtual reality is not, or at least need not be, a second-class reality. It really can be a first-class reality. Thank you very much.
Let's take a question or two for Dave. Deepak, why don't you come up while we're doing that, please? Who's ready? Go ahead.
I'm ready. I'm really excited about Dave's idea of virtual realism. I understand that it is consistent and really very closely related to digital realism. I want to ask whether there would be a version of virtual realism, broad virtual realism, that would incorporate a broader view of virtual reality. For instance, if somebody hooked up to our brain and created virtual reality, that would be a non-digital virtual realism. And also there's an older view on virtual reality before digital. You know, a Chinese theater with dancing shades, something like that. So I would propose that we have narrow virtual realism that really counts very well and agrees very well with virtual reality the way most people understand it today, and a broad one.
I'm happy to allow there are different notions of virtual reality here. And it's true that Antonin Artaud, who first introduced the term la réalité virtuelle, used it for the theater, and nothing digital about that. I think the most common contemporary usage is for something computer-generated, and that's what my conclusions apply to. But it's also true that insofar as all this structure is realized in something non-computational, for example, and perhaps even in the minds of other people, could come to realize this structure, or perhaps if the universe is some giant it from bit metaphysics, then the conclusion would also apply. So it's an interesting question just how far one could extend it. But given what I say about the end, about the structure being what mattered, I'd be prepared to extend the conclusion to arbitrary ways of realizing this structural reality.
One more for Dave.
Hey, Dave. So talking about virtual structuralism, one issue that comes about in certain VR worlds, particularly gaming, is exploiters. People basically coming in and breaking the rules of the game, changing the laws of physics within the game. Now, that is obviously not something that we encounter in any of our real-life experience.
I think I might have heard about that in a couple of concurrent sessions here.
Is that introducing a fiction, then? At what point is it less of a reality if someone is introducing a fiction into that virtual world that was not intended by the original programmers?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, to what extent is breaking the laws possible? Of course, some people believe that breaking the laws is possible in our world, and that, for example, gods get to do it from time to time. I think it really comes down to I'm inclined to think that just if in our physical reality, God or some of us had the capacity to break the laws of physics on occasion, that wouldn't make this world less real. It would just make it kind of more interesting and a little bit more chaotic. Now, maybe there's an end of the spectrum where if it turns out there are no laws at all, it's all chaos and all bets are off and anything anyone ever wants to happen can happen, then it's lacking at least some of the stability and order that we want of a genuine reality. But I think even, we can read stories in the Bible about miracles happening without that challenging our sense of this being real. Likewise, I think in a virtual reality, if there are just occasional breakages of the laws due to loopholes in the game design, that isn't enough to make it unreal.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's open it up to both. There are long lines, so please make your questions brief. No.
Okay, yes, I want to interact to Deepak talk. First of all, I agree with him that consciousness is ontological and fundamental in life since the beginning of the Big Bang. And in fact, it encompasses everything from the galaxies to the single atom and to the molecule. So I think of a unified field of energy, conscious energy, that will represent consciousness. However, as far as his body-mind is concerned, well, I break down the mind into heart and brain interaction. And the intelligence of the heart is the basis of human consciousness that is going to bring the transformation and a new shift in the paradigm of human life. Only through our emotion, our heart, that we are going to make peace, love, compassion, and acceptance of the others. Thank you.
Peace, love, compassion, joy are qualia experiences, and they're the most significant, whether they're localized to the heart, to the brain, or they're part of existence is a moot point because, as Schrodinger said, consciousness cannot be divided or multiplied. In his view, it was a singularity. But yes, the heart has reasons that reason doesn't know, as Blaise Pascal said.
Hi, quick question for Dave. I really like the way you emphasize the role of value in VR. And I wonder, however, since we're talking about temporary VR, whether the real question should be what the value of experiences in one form of reality, virtual or physical, have for our experiences or actions in the other, because we're always swapping between. So in VR, for instance, we already know that VR avatar therapy can be very good for schizophrenics or for post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. And likewise in fiction, reading a book can give us a greater understanding of life and whatnot that can then affect how we act in the real world. So the danger then, I wonder if you see this, is where that direction of travel might get inverted, so that now our actions in the real world are taken so as to change our experiences in the virtual world. What about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are many complicated questions about the interaction of life in virtual worlds and life in real worlds. There's a nice cartoon I didn't get to show of somebody just jumping off the cliff, and they say, well, that worked totally fine in this video game I was just playing, but then you see them crashed in a heap at the bottom of the heap. I mean, in a way, it's surprising we managed to separate them as well as we do. And I think that might have something to do with the cognitive orientation to virtual worlds. It goes along quite naturally with situationism in psychology. One develops a set of affordances that are distinct for certain kinds of reality, but there's also a lot of crosstalk, and obviously that can create dangers. Violent behavior, which is paradigmatic in many video games, could, at least in principle, lead to that kind of behavior being more tolerated in non-virtual reality. And as far as I can tell, the data on that is still a bit unclear. But you were worried about moving in the other direction?
Well, it's just, it seems to me that you were trying to say that they could be as valuable as each other.
Yeah.
But my counterargument to that would be that almost, as you said, that if you kill someone in a virtual world, it doesn't really matter that much. If you do it in the real world, it matters a great deal. And so our experiences might have equal value in the sense that we're dealing with real virtual objects, and I completely agree with that. But there does seem to be an asymmetry in terms of the consequences of our actions in these different worlds.
Yeah, now there is an asymmetry tied to birth and death, I think. Birth is a lot harder in a virtual world, bringing new lives into existence, except maybe for artificial virtual agents, which we haven't gotten to yet with current technology, and likewise death. Unlike in the Matrix and the Oculus Rift, if your character dies, you don't die. Now, you can imagine that in a very long term, and I gather in World of Warcraft, when you die, you just got to go to the nearest graveyard to get reincarnated, so it's not a big deal. You can imagine a virtual reality where when you die in the VR, you can't re-enter, and if you've been spent many years there building up a history, death could be very serious, but it's true that you would still get to exist in the next level up. Whether anything like that goes on in physical reality, I leave to the theists here, but I do agree that it's at least one potential structural disanalogy between the two, and I think Deepak.
I just want to comment that for the last 3 years I've been experimenting with VR, both for spiritual experiences and then medical reasons. So the spiritual game that will be out in 2 months actually allows you to be in a very rich sensory environment of form, and then everything starts shimmering into activity, and then everything disappears into formlessness, and all that's left is formless being. And that is a very experiential understanding of non-locality. And the second application is medical, and it was inspired by Ramachandran's work, where Ramachandran had done this experiment where if you're in a certain arrangement of mirrors and you move your right hand, you get the feedback in consciousness that your left hand is moving. So we are now experimenting with paralyzed patients, and they move, so let's say their left hand is paralyzed, and they keep moving their right hand, but the feedback is the left hand moving. That experience in consciousness, because we don't know where the experience happens. I think everybody will grant that the nervous system is a representation of the experience, but it's not actual experience. Wherever that experience is, I believe it's a dimensionless being, but that experience actually causes synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. And this has huge applications. VR, the best applications, I think, will be for treatment of phobias, depression, weight control, diabetes, heart disease. I can guarantee you that in 5 years, you go to a good physician and they'll say, well, I have a VR experience for your condition.
I think in Barcelona, Chalmers group is using VR to treat for neuro rehab already for strokes.
A lot of us today are having the experience, a different conscious experience with people online, which we're going to be more of than face-to-face relationships. As we move into VR, the permissions and adaptations with the avatars, the data structures that represent other human beings are only going to multiply. Are either of you looking into the implications of moving to and from the virtual world and the kinds of problems that we might be faced with?
No, not really. I guess no, only in a very superficial way. So far, I think many other people are beginning to look at this. I would just say that these, of course, are problems which are not new to VR, and this general issue of the complexifying of our environments. We take on very different roles. One interacts with people, the same person, even different in a family context to a physical job context. One takes on different roles. I think many of the same social phenomena, which are already happening in a non-virtual environment, will now be extended to a virtual environment. The roles and the personas we take on will come all the more complicated, and I fully expect it's going to bring a whole lot of new phenomena in play. But I take it that the sociologists and the psychologists are thinking hard about that.
So in line with that, if you heard my talk, I think the conclusion is it's all virtual, that the VR world, so I would actually go along with virtual realism, because I think this is also virtual realism. The way this is construed and constructed in consciousness is the same thing. But in answer to his question, you already with the internet, you can give somebody a dopamine hit in South Africa without going there. But if you have a real immersive virtual experience of that, you can affect their well-being and their consciousness.
So what do you think? I'm curious, what do you think about the world outside of our consciousness? So when the scientist does an experiment and a bunch of scientists do the same experiment, is there something external to their consciousness that's bringing that about?
As Niels Bohr said, nature reveals to us not as she is, but to the questions we ask us. And even John Wheeler said, every experiment shows that we agree on the questions and we are participating in the answers that we receive. So we are participating in the creation of every reality. Reality at a fundamental level is experientially, at least, species specific, has to be. And as a fundamental level, all these physical realities are in superposition till the experience happens. And so we agree in science how to do the observations. And we have a nervous system that actually participates collectively as human beings. The only universe you have access to is the human universe. If there are other universes, which we can presume there are, with other species, then they are experientially inaccessible to us.
So if we find results, say, from some experiments from 200 years ago about, say, the coherence of matter, which are only best explained by quantum mechanics, or some other science that we come up with 200 years later, the standard explanation is this is because there is a mind-independent world of, say, quantum mechanics and the wave function and certain dynamics that explain why experimenters got those results 200 years ago before we ever made up quantum mechanics. Is it somehow when the experimenters performed that experiment 200 years ago, they had to make up quantum mechanics without realizing it to get those results?
Some quantum mechanics says that those results are retrocausal and delayed choice experiments. And John Wheeler would have said that. And right now, Aronoff, with his weak measurements, is saying that. And I think we're going to hear a lot about you construct the universe when you experience it.